So today, fiscal policy, like we said, but before we start, let's have a look about these different things we'll be covering. So fiscal policy is mainly about taxes and government spending, and they use these tools in order to control the level of demand in the economy. So we'll be covering that. We'll be looking at expansionary versus contractionary fiscal policy, why we want to do fiscal policy, some advantages and disadvantages, and so on. So I'm sure you guys have heard about the UK Furlough Scheme. If you're not from the UK, what the Furlough Scheme entails is basically if you are currently an employee of a company in the UK and the company is unable to pay your wages because there's not enough customers or not enough business due to the coronavirus recession, then the government would pay the employees' wages on behalf of the company. So essentially, the government is spending their money to subsidize businesses in order to help them survive throughout the crisis, and they kind of help them keep their staff. So more people would still be in their jobs instead of being unemployed. You can see the furlough scheme is really popular because essentially it reduces business costs. But supposedly those employees or staff that are furloughed are not supposed to work, because otherwise then you would kind of be like cheating the system, because supposedly you can't afford those staff, which is why the government is helping you pay for that amount of labor. So yeah, we can see 1 in 4 UK workers are now furloughed here. So there's like a massive impact on the economy. Imagine if the government stops furloughing workers tomorrow, then potentially there will be mass like unemployment, and of course that will be quite bad for the economy. So one of the things that we want to consider, since we're talking about fiscal policy, is how the furlough scheme actually fuel consumption in the economy. So in general, if the government is still helping these businesses pay their workers' wages, then as a result, the workers would have higher incomes. Then definitely the workers would still be able to spend their money and their incomes on goods and services, which actually helps the economy because that consumption would generate demand for goods and services and revenues and profits for other businesses. So it's kind of like a positive chain effect, if you like to think about it. So this is one of the ways which the furlough scheme can help. That's kind of it for the furlough scheme, and we'll kind of like refer back to it as you'll see later. So what is fiscal policy? Fiscal policy is when the government spends more money or spends money in general, or if they tax us through income tax or VAT and things like that. So whenever the government increases or decreases their spending or increases or decreases their taxes, then it can be considered part of fiscal policy. And because the government spending would actually affect the level of demand in the economy, since if the government spends more, it would create more jobs and potentially increase the level of incomes of particular groups, then as a result it would affect AD, which is aggregate demand. Therefore, it would affect inflation and real GDP. So if the government suddenly wants to build a new railway, then as a result they would hire more workers and it would increase the level of production in the economy. And because both fiscal policy and monetary policy affects demand, we call these demand side policies. Yeah. So this is different from the supply side policies that we looked at 2 weeks ago. We can see there's like the economy is kind of like a huge machine, and then like the government kind of wants to manipulate the level of spending and the level of taxes in order to kind of make this machine work more efficiently or work better. But sometimes the government would trip on its own toes as well. So if we look into this further, I'm not sure if you guys have come across the equation of AD, or aggregate demand, yet. So the total level of demand in the economy can be calculated by this equation. So it's consumption plus investment plus government spending plus exports minus imports. So since government spending is a part of this equation, if we increase government spending, it would immediately increase the level of aggregate demand in the economy. Since the government, when they spend more, they're essentially buying or demanding more goods. If you are familiar with the circular flow of income, you would know that when the government spends money, it would be counted as an injection into the circular flow. So there'd be more money flowing between households and firms, and as a result, this would increase AD, and it can also lead to a positive multiplier effect for the economy. Because when the government spends, say, on a new railway, then as a result, those railway workers would earn incomes, and those railway workers would also carry on to buy other goods and services, which would lead to like a multiplier effect. So an even bigger effect than the original spending by the government. So the furlough scheme, of course, would be a type of fiscal policy because the UK government is spending in order to support the wages of workers. And therefore, because we're spending so much money on this furlough scheme, the UK, of course, would need to borrow even more money with like 350 billion. We're going to exceed 350 billion amounts of borrowing this year, I believe. And hopefully when the furlough scheme ends, we won't have like a massive recession and massive job losses. So as usual, if you've got any questions, just pop in the chat like DXL did. So in order to understand how government spending and taxation works, we also want to look at the government budget. So we can see, let me just get out my highlighter, not highlighter, but like my pointy pen. We can see we've got income taxes is actually the biggest amount of money that the government gets. Whereas national insurance and VAT is like the second and the third biggest amount of revenue for the government. So if you're not familiar with income taxes, it's basically how much you pay the government when you work. So let's say if you earn 10 grand, then if income taxes are 10%, that means each year you're going to pay 1 grand to the government. So actually it can be quite substantial, especially in the UK with the welfare state. The income taxes can be quite high. And of course VAT is a type of indirect tax. So VAT, whenever you buy anything or sell anything, you need to pay like 20% of VAT of that particular good or service's value. So it's actually quite expensive, VAT, and because it's so expensive, the government will be able to generate so much tax income from the VAT. Oh, hi Saint just Germany. Thanks for following. I like your username. Yeah, so that's kind of like how the money goes into the government in order to fund all of the spending that we have. So what does the government spend money on? So the government spends money on social protection. So within social protection, what this is basically welfare. So that includes unemployment benefits, so UE benefits, and then we've got pensions as well. So for those people that are retired and still rely on support from the government monthly. And also things like universal income as well. So universal benefits, not universal income. So social protection is mainly like the amount of money that we pay in order to help those in need. And then we've got NHS, of course, and then education as well. So state schools, universities, all of those subsidies. Okay, cool. So we can kind of see where the money comes in for the government and where the money comes out. And of course, for the furlough scheme, then we would add some money here, like furlough scheme or something. So I don't know, something billion, whatever. And when the government spends more, increases or decreases the budget, and all of this would be part of fiscal policy as well. So if they spend more or if they spend less, then it will affect the economy and the level of demand in the economy. So whenever the government isn't able to afford their spending, we can see that the government only took in like 600 billion taxes, but actually they're spending 700 billion pounds, then the government would need to borrow money from financial institutions and financial markets through government bonds. So we'll talk more about bonds later in the course when we talk about financial markets, but just know that basically the government tends to borrow a lot of money when they can't finance their funding. But all of these budget stuff is like in 2013, so you can kind of look at the up-to-date budget from the government on their website. Okay, so if you prefer like pie charts, we all have like pie charts here. So again, most of the spending is from social protection, health, education, and then the government rakes in income tax, national insurance, and VAT. So in general, if the government spends more, it would be an injection into the circular flow of income, and there'll be more demand for goods and services. Thus, it would create more economic activity because we will need to produce more goods, and people are getting like more income from the goods and services that the government buys. So because of this stimulus or this ability to stimulate the economy, the government will want to stimulate the economy when the economy is in a recession, right? But not when the economy is in a boom. So if you guys are familiar with the economic cycle, so normally we've got GDP on the left hand side, and then we've got the time period here. So this is kind of over time, most economies tend to grow, and however, it tends to grow at like an unsteady state. So sometimes when things are good, everyone is like making money in the stock market, and the economy might be growing very well because everyone is very confident and happy. But however, suddenly COVID happens. So let's say COVID happens, and then there's like a massive recession. So in order to kind of help the economy go back on track, the government might try to stimulate the economy at these places, right? In order to help achieve positive or increase the GDP again, so that would have positive economic growth. So ideally, the government would want to kind of flatten these peaks and troughs so that the economic growth is kind of like more steady. And steady economic growth is good because businesses would be more confident in the economy, and they can kind of project how much money they should invest in the future and how much profits they'll be able to make from that. So the government wants stable economic growth, and some of these policies that they do is in order to enable and achieve these macroeconomic objectives that the governments have. Whenever the government or the economy is in a recession, the government wants to spend more than what they're taxing. So the government spending, G, should be greater than taxation in order to stimulate the economy. Because otherwise, if you're taxing more from the economy, the economy and the circular flow of income would just shrink even more. So that doesn't make sense, right? We want to stimulate the economy when the economy is bad, and we want to kind of take money away from the economy if it is overheated and if there's too much inflation in the economy. So yeah, in this case of COVID, we want to spend more money. The more the better. And actually, I'm not sure if you guys remember something called austerity. It was like 10 years ago. You guys might be like babies. So in like 2010s, like the government, like the past decade, the government, especially the Conservative Party, they were doing a lot of austerity measures. And austerity basically reduces the amount of welfare benefits and payments to families in need, or those that are taking in universal benefits from the government. And this actually contracted the economy, especially after the economic crisis in 2009. So it's actually, the economy kind of suffered like a double whammy, in the sense that the government is kind of reducing their spending, but also they had the financial crisis, so that was quite bad. Yeah, exactly. So that would be an anti-cyclical policy, St. Just Germany. And it's kind of like a policy conflict. Like the government is kind of making an error, but in a sense, they're trying to reduce their budget deficit and their national debt. But in the same way, they're actually acting against it by taking money away from the economy. So we can see the inherent links between the economy and politics and what the government decides to do at times, which might not always be the best thing. Yeah, there we go. So this photo is quite good, I think. So we've got like, this is from 1780s to the 2010s. We can see the blue bars are the years when the Conservative Party is in power, and whereas the red bars are when the Labour are in power, I believe. And so Labour and Conservative. So you can see in most years we are actually borrowing money and we're spending more than we're taxing. It's only for like these spectacular years that we're actually saving money for the government, or the government is actually taking more money from the economy rather than giving it. So in a sense, we're borrowing a lot. And here, 2008, 2009, we were bailing out the banks. So banks bail out because of the financial crisis. So we can see that we're actually spending massive amounts of money and borrowing massive amounts. And in general, we would think that the Labour Party would spend more money on like benefits, whereas the Conservative Party might like spend less. But we can see actually the Conservative Party tends to run a lot of budget deficit as well, because spending money would tend to win you votes, and nobody wants a government that raises taxes. So you won't be very popular if you raise taxes every time you get into office. And another thing to consider as well, given the current circumstances, is that supposedly we're going to spend a lot of money. So we might want to compare the spending this year with the amount we borrow from the banks, which would be quite interesting. Okay, next. So talking about borrowing, if the government borrows more than that they're actually taking in, so if the government's spending more in terms of government spending than how much they're taking in terms of taxes, we would call that as running a fiscal deficit or a budget deficit. So a budget deficit is when the government is spending too much in that particular year. So let me just put that here, because it's easy to get confused. So if you've got a budget deficit, it's that your spending, government spending, is greater than your taxation that year. But if it is like a fiscal deficit, there are two types. So we can see there's like a cyclical and a structural fiscal deficit. So if we've got like a cyclical fiscal deficit, this is when the economy is in a recession, and therefore the government needs to spend more to stimulate the economy. So in the short term, this is kind of like more manageable and this is more okay, because when the economy gets better, we should be able to take in more taxes and kind of fill the gap of spending that we're doing. So like some types of shocks here, or COVID, things like that. And also we need to take in mind that when the economy isn't doing well, the government would automatically be spending more, since more people would be unemployed, then more people would be claiming unemployment benefits. Whereas when the economy is doing well, then there will be less people claiming these unemployment benefits, so the government would spend less anyway. So that's kind of like the cyclical fiscal deficit, but whereas a structural fiscal deficit is more problematic. So whenever you see things called structural, it means long term, and it's quite bad and it's hard to solve. So say there's something called the UK pension crisis. Essentially, you can see, since nowadays people are like living longer, and the medical fees are like hiking up as well. So the amount of money that the government needs to pay to the elderly or the boomer generation would be increasing. So we can see here our retirement bill is actually up like 1 trillion in 5 years, and we can see the government spending in terms of pensions are actually increasing year on year in terms of a percentage of GDP. So that is quite bad for the government budget, because it's kind of like a structural problem and a long-term problem that the government needs to deal with, but it's not like a 1 year thing, or it's not like a one recession thing, right? So that is what we call a structural fiscal deficit, is when the government needs to continually spend too much money, more than their tax revenue, in order to cope with these demographic or structural economic issues. Okay, yes, so St. Just Jeremy just said, people could agree with raising taxes if this money is used for good things. Yes, I agree. But it's also kind of like the human nature that we want to avoid losing money. So it's called loss aversion, right? So I agree that in many cases taxes should increase in order to fund important things like NHS and education, but it's difficult to convince the crowds when you're a politician and to say to them that an increase in taxes would actually benefit you and your kids. So for example, if I tell, I don't know, the people of London that let's increase taxes in order to fund better healthcare or to fund education, then essentially you might gain the votes. Maybe you might not gain the votes of them as well, but you might gain the votes of families that have children, but then you're losing votes of people without children, because like they are actually paying you taxes in order to fund other people's education. So, but whereas if I tell the people of London that everyone will have their taxes decreased, then essentially everyone is like earning more money the next year. So it's kind of like a more easier way to get votes. But I agree that it's important to raise taxes, especially when times are good, despite of the vested political interests that we are facing. Okay, could you explain budget deficit again? Yes, so I can do that quickly. So a budget deficit is when the government spends more money than they're receiving from taxes in that particular year. Yeah. So if the government spent like 100 million on NHS and education in that year, but they only taken like 50 million in terms of like income taxes, then this would be a budget deficit. So we can also see that there's like the amount of national debt that we have, and it's like 2.4 trillion pounds. So in total, because we're running like a budget deficit year on year or many years, for many years, we've kind of accumulated a massive amount of national debt, which is not really good for the economy, because it might restrict our future ability to lend money, not to borrow money, not to lend money here. And of course, we need to pay back interest on that debt as well. So the amount of interest we're currently paying on the national debt is similar to the amount that the government spends in terms of the defense budget. So we're spending as much money on the military as we are spending on the interest on that amount of debt that the government owes other people. So that's kind of crazy if we think about it, how much that is. Okay, so we've talked about fiscal policy, but sometimes a fiscal policy can also be a supply side policy. The reason being is if the government spends money on projects that can actually increase the aggregate supply of the economy, then essentially that fiscal policy is not only just government spending, but also government spending that increases aggregate supply, hence therefore it would be a supply side policy as well, because the government is investing in things like infrastructure or education or the labor force. So this is the case with HS2. So HS2 has just begun in terms of its rail project, and supposedly it should help create 22,000 jobs. So we've got lovely Boris here, our Prime Minister with the HS2 hat. So I think Boris always likes to visit these places. So I think he went to Oxford in order to look at how the COVID vaccines are doing, and then he just gives really funny comments. But anyway, so he's very involved, as we can see. Supposedly, the HS2 would be able to create more jobs, and of course that's good for the economy, because the government spending on HS2 would help employ more people, then they would have more income and they would spend more good money on goods and services, then this would kind of increase AD in the economy, which would lead to economic growth. But in a sense, this policy is also a supply side policy, because the infrastructure, HS2, would be able to allow people to travel to different places within the country much easier and with much shorter timings. So as a result, it would be able to reduce the business costs and the travel timings of businesses, and therefore it should make us more productive and more efficient. Thus, it would shift out aggregate supply as well. So just be careful whenever you're dealing with government spending on infrastructure or government spending on education. You can interpret it both as a supply side policy, but also as a demand side policy. Okay, next one. So we've talked a lot about the government spending. Now let's talk about the other side of the coin, about taxation. Yeah. So the government can increase or decrease its spending, and similarly, the government can also increase or decrease its taxation. So if the government decreases the taxation and the government is taking less money from the economy, then this is stimulating the economy as well, because we're leaving the economy with more money within the circular flow of income between the households and the businesses. So for the government taxation, if we reduce the taxation, it would stimulate the economy, but if we increase the taxation, it would shrink the economy. And of course, during these times of uncertainty and business disaster, we've got a reduction in taxation to stimulate the economy. So we can see, I'm not sure if you guys know what stamp duty is. So stamp duty is basically tax you pay when you buy a property. It's tax you pay when you buy a house. I'm not sure if any of you guys are homeowners. But homes are very, very expensive in general. But yeah, so normally if you buy a home, you gotta pay stamp duty. But since the housing market is not expected to do well, they have relieved or reduced those taxes so that we don't need to pay them. In Germany, there was a lot of talk about code progression, meaning if your income rises, the taxes rise even more. So you have less money because you earned more in the first place. Yes. So that, what you have described, just Germany, is that it's called progressive taxes. Yeah. So we will kind of get onto that a bit later in this lesson. Essentially, when you earn more incomes, you would be in a higher tax bracket. So that means the additional money that you earn, say if you got a promotion, would be taxed even more. Like the rate would be even higher. So as a result, even though you did earn more, it isn't as much as you would think. And progressive taxes tend to help balance the economy in the sense that it would help with the level of inequality and income distribution of the economy. But more on that later. So the UK government haven't decreased income taxes yet, or they haven't kind of messed with direct taxes yet. But the government is planning a tax break for businesses and also has reduced VAT on tourism and hospitality here. So supposedly this should allow businesses to earn more profits, and also as a result they will be able to spend more money on investment, which again increases the level of demand for goods and services in the economy. Thus it would stimulate the economy. Okay, so there are different types of taxes here. So we've got direct tax and indirect tax. So a direct tax is taxes that are levied directly on your income or on business profits. So income taxes would be a type of direct tax, or corporation tax. Corporation tax. Oh, there we go. Corporation tax would be a type of direct tax. So if you earned $1 grand by baking bread, I always like using the bread example. Let's say this is like a baguette. There we go. And if you earn £1,000 worth of profits, the corporation tax currently is around like 20%. So you need to pay like £200 of profits to the government. So actually quite a lot. If the government reduces that, that would be good for businesses. Whereas indirect tax are taxes that you pay when you buy or sell a good or service, so like VAT. So you're actually paying it, but you might not actually realize. So without VAT, everything in the economy should be slightly cheaper, and we would be richer, because if everything is cheaper, we'll be able to buy more stuff. But also things like alcohol and tobacco tax, sugar tax, and all of those would be indirect taxes. So taxes you pay when you consume goods and services. So apart from direct and indirect taxes, there are also two ways of describing the type of taxes, called progressive or regressive. So a progressive tax means that the tax is charging those with higher incomes a bigger proportion of money. Whereas if it is a regressive tax, it means that it's charging those with lower incomes a bigger proportion of their money. So let me explain. Let's say for VAT would be a type of regressive tax, because say if you buy a piece of bread for £10 and VAT might be 20%, so VAT is like £2, right? So no matter you're rich or poor, you would still need to pay £2 for the piece of bread in terms of taxes. But if you're earning, so let's say if there are two types of families here. One family is earning £1 grand a year, which is not very much, and probably can't survive with that. And then another family is earning like 10 grand a year. So this is like the richer family, and there's the poorer family. The poorer family is paying £2 out of their £1,000, right? So in percentage terms, this is what, like 0.2%. But you can see the richer family is also paying £2. So in percentage terms, there's only 0.02% of their incomes. So we would call the VAT a regressive tax, because it's taxing the poor family a high percentage in terms of their income. But it's taxing the richer family a lower percentage of their income. So in general, regressive tax would make society less equal, or it would increase the wealth gap, because the £2 actually matters more to the poor than the rich. Whereas the progressive taxes are of course the other way around. So it's like the more you earn, you would need to pay more income taxes, like the Germany example. Okay, so that's... Okay, next, fiscal policy and taxes. So like we previously discussed, if the government decreases the taxes, it's going to trigger an injection into the circular flow of income, and it would increase incomes of households, and it would create jobs and therefore promote spending on goods and services, increase demand in the economy, and stimulate the economy. So again, we've got Taxman here. Have you guys seen the previous lessons? Taxman tends to make an appearance. However, when the economy isn't doing well, or if the economy isn't as hot, like currently, we have a recession, then we've got a kryptonite for the taxman. And the taxman won't be able to come for us because we don't have money for the taxman. So because of the recession, the government would decide to tax us less in order to stimulate the economy and to give us a break as well. So I guess I shouldn't be portraying us as like the villain, right? So we should be Superman, but like, well. So Taxman should be the villain. Okay, so some of you might not be very familiar with economic diagrams if you're not studying economics at school or for a particular course, but we'll just talk about this briefly. So we can see that when we decrease taxes, or if we increase government spending, then we will increase the level of demand in the economy. And demand in the economy can be illustrated by this curve called the aggregate demand, which is like the total level of demand in the economy. So if we decrease taxes or increase government spending, then the level of demand would increase, and whenever it increases, AD would shift outwards. So therefore, in this diagram, we can see that the price level in the economy would increase because people are buying more goods and services, and therefore they are willing to pay a higher price for it. And also, the GDP would increase as well, since we need to produce more goods and services in order to satisfy that demand. So we've talked about this. We would do it in a recession, reduce taxes or increase government spending so that we would be able to grow the economy once again. So here is an anomaly, kind of an anomaly for you, but as we've discussed previously, the government has cut the taxes we need to pay when we buy a property. So, and because of that cut, actually it's stimulating the housing market. And as a result, the housing market has actually increased in prices slightly because of the tax cut. But supposedly in a recession, we shouldn't have increasing housing prices, because in a recession, people are unemployed, they won't be able to get a mortgage, they won't be able to borrow money from a bank to buy a house, or they won't be able to afford to buy a new house, right? So we can see here the tax duty that the government has reduced, the stamp duty cut, is actually quite effective. So we can see that there's actually an increase in the housing prices during a recession, which is actually quite odd. But however, this might change after the furlough scheme ends and we have like massive unemployment. We'll see. So maybe better not to buy a property right now. The property market might not be so hot. Okay. So we've discussed a bit about this already. So these are just two of the ways that the government can implement the fiscal policy by reducing. So one is by reducing corporation tax or reducing taxation. Then the businesses would have more profits if we're taxing them less. And if they have more profits, then hopefully, fingers crossed, they should increase the level of investment. So by investment, I mean they might buy more machinery or they might hire more people in order to expand their business. And therefore, this will increase demand in the economy and stimulate it. Or another way to do fiscal policy, if the economy is doing too well, would be increase in the taxes, right? So if we increase taxes, then it would reduce the incomes that the households are getting. Therefore, the families would spend more money on goods and services, the businesses would earn less profits, and as a result, this would help contract the economy. And the reason we want to contract the economy when the economy is doing very well is because we might want to control the level of inflation in the economy. So this is one of the reasons. Okay, taxation and supply side policy. So we've got like the government spending as well, taxation can also be a type of supply side policy, because supposedly if we cut taxes on businesses, they would have more money, and when they invest, then this might increase the overall level of production in the economy in the long run. Because if they've got more machines and if they're hiring more people, then as a result, this would increase and grow the economy and increase aggregate supply or total supply within the economy. So in a sense, it's not only improving the demand side, it's not just increasing the level of demand in the economy by reducing taxes in the short run, but also it's helping to grow the economy in the long run as a supply side policy. So just kind of be aware of that as well when you're approaching tax cuts. So it can kind of be classified by both. You know the I can't pronounce satirical songs about Keynes and Hayek. So saying just Germany. No, actually, but I've seen this rap of Keynes versus Hayek. So if you guys are interested, you guys can look it up. So let me just put it here. Oh yes, the rap is pretty good, isn't it? So Keynes versus Hayek, epic rap battle. So if you're bored on YouTube but you want to do some economics stuff, you can search this on YouTube. So it's like a rap battle between the two economic thinkers. So coming back to supply side policy and the reduction in taxation, it might not always work. Because what I mean by that, if you reduce the taxes on businesses, they might not always expand their business and increase the investment. Instead, the businesses can just take the money out and just give it to their shareholders and owners. So as a result, trickle-down economics might not work. So what trickle-down economics is supposedly if the rich get richer, then the poor would get richer as well because the rich would spend more. But it doesn't necessarily work. Or if we reduce taxes on businesses, then people would get richer and they would spend more or invest more. But as we can see in this comic, there's no evidence that reducing company tax would lead to wage rises and more jobs. But then we've got vested interest that's changing the opinion of politicians. But anyway, it might work to an extent. It's good to, if you're interested, it's good to look up the research on it. Yeah. So when the government, as taking money away from the economy instead of stimulating it, we would call it a contractionary fiscal policy. Yeah. So the two terms here are contractionary versus expansionary. So expansionary is like getting bigger, right? So if the government is stimulating the economy, it's like an expansionary fiscal policy. But if the economy is contracting, then that means that it's shrinking. So again, very similar diagram. We can see that AD would decrease in this case from AD to AD1 because the government is taking away demand from the economy by spending less money or taking more money away from households and businesses. Therefore, the level of demand in the economy would decrease and aggregate demand would shift inwards to signal like a decrease. And because of that, things would get cheaper because there'll be less people buying them and we'll be producing less goods and services. Therefore, the level of economic output, real GDP in the economy, would fall. And we can see this kind of helps to control an inflation because if the prices are decreasing, then things won't get more expensive. So the government would tend to do this when the economy is doing well and prices are spiraling out of control, like when property prices are increasing significantly. Once upon a time, the economy was doing well, and we can see that the government had increased VAT in the past. So these are kind of like all the different VAT rates in the past, and we can see that VAT used to be quite low actually in like 1970s or something, and VAT did not tend to be as regressive as it was nowadays. So because like during this period, you can see the VAT, it's only taxed for some luxury goods, or the tax rate is higher for luxury goods. So in a sense, assuming that people with higher incomes would buy those luxury goods, they might be paying a bigger proportion of their income, rather than the poor paying a bigger proportion of their income. So it also depends on what type of goods that the VAT is implemented on. And then we can see after the financial crisis and after the economy kind of recovers, the government has increased VAT. So, we've talked about how tax rises aren't usually popular politically. And one of the ways of doing so is through VAT. It's kind of less visible because essentially you are just paying taxes by buying and selling stuff, and you do not actually realize how much you're paying since we buy so many different goods and services each day. So as a result, if you increase VAT as a method to increase tax revenue and to fund like healthcare and education, it might have less of an impact on votes, or it is kind of called more of an invisible tax. So it's more favorable than increasing like income taxes or business taxes. But of course, we don't want to overdo it as well, because otherwise we might become uncompetitive and it might cause inflation. So so we've talked about how the VAT would decrease the income of the poor by like 2.7%, which is higher than those that are richest, so, which we are only decreasing by like 1%. Okay, cool. So you can read that at your own time. Okay, fiscal policy evaluation. So evaluation is just basically, now we want to think about when we want to use fiscal policy and in what circumstances, and also how can fiscal policy help the government achieve their macroeconomic objectives or goals for the economy, if we put it in simpler terms. So we've got economic growth. If the government wants to achieve economic growth, like during these times of COVID, we would want to use expansionary fiscal policy and increase demand. So keep in mind that if the fiscal policy is non-targeted, then it might not be as effective in increasing the level of supply in the economy. So what I mean by this is, let's say if we just reduce income taxes for everyone, then it's not really a supply side policy. It has to be more targeted, like if it's focused on education or if it's focused on infrastructure spending, then there would be more of a supply side policy. So yeah, this is just another example, to help out, so everyone's like spending lots of money because the government is kind of subsidizing meals. So we can see how government spending can actually help promote or stimulate the economy. Unemployment, so we've talked about HS2, so we can see fiscal policy can be effective in tackling unemployment in the short run. And that's because when we increase the level of demand in the economy, the firms need to hire more workers in order to produce those goods and services that we like or that we want. Therefore, we would be able to create more jobs in the economy, basically. If the policy is based on like labor training or like reskilling the workers as well, especially nowadays because the hospitality and the tourism industry are quite worse off, then if the government spends money on retraining those workers into other industries, maybe like the tech industry, for example, then this might be even more effective. Because again, it would not only be like a demand side policy, but also a supply side policy, since it helps the unemployed workers find jobs in the long run. Inflation, so again, we've talked about this. So if we want to control inflation and decrease the price level in the economy, we just want to decrease the level of demand in the economy. And in order to do that, the government would take money away from the economy by either increasing taxes or reducing government spending. However, there is a problem. If the inflation is not caused by the level of demand in the economy, for example, if the inflation is caused by the level of supply in the economy, called cost push inflation, then the fiscal policy would not be very effective in this case, because it doesn't help with the root cause of the problem. So what cost push inflation is that when the cost of doing business, such as acquiring raw materials, is too expensive, then businesses would need to charge even more for their goods and services, and this would kind of like lead to high levels of inflation. And therefore, if we're experiencing this, instead of having too much inflation because the economy is overheated, then it might not be very helpful to use fiscal policy to fix inflation. So the type of inflation would be something to consider if we are using fiscal policy to tackle inflation. Okay, for balance of payments, so what balance of payments is, if we recall, is we would be concerned with imports and exports. Yeah. Oh, where? Here. Imports and exports. So normally, we would assume if we're richer, we would import more. And if we're importing more, then as a result, it would harm the balance of payments. And the reason being, or it would harm the current account. Yeah. So the reason importing more is not necessarily good for the economy is because, again, the economy is kind of losing money, or money is flowing out of the economy in order to buy goods and services from other countries. So one of the ways to kind of avoid imports or to reduce imports would be to use contractionary fiscal policy. Because if we increase the level of taxes, then people would have less income left over for these expensive imports or exotic goods from other countries. Then they would reduce the level of imports and help the current account. So I'm not sure what type of exotic goods you buy overseas. So having a Chinese takeaway doesn't count as an import. Because having a Chinese takeaway, you're still helping the local UK economy, since the Chinese restaurant is in the UK. But if you buy less cars from Germany, then as a result, you would be reducing the level of imports in our economy and for the UK. But yeah, so saying just Germany, you've pointed out that Germany's exports are actually higher than their imports. It's actually quite uncommon for a Western country or a first world country to have more exports than imports, and like Germany is kind of one of them within the EU. And so if we go back to fiscal policy, the effectiveness of fiscal policy also depends on the marginal propensity of import of citizens. So like in Germany, perhaps people, I'm not sure about this, but you can tell me, I'm not sure how much people import in Germany. Maybe they don't like foreign goods and they believe in like German products. Then this means people would actually import less, even if there's a rise in income. So even if people are earning more, they might actually import less, and as a result, in Germany, if you're implementing contractionary fiscal policy to help with the current account, then as a result, it might not be very effective, because even though you're decreasing the incomes of Germans, they don't import a lot anyway, so it doesn't really help. Okay, and then I've got like another question. Can I ask what was the second benefit? What do you mean? So like the second benefit of using fiscal policy? I'll get back to you. But yeah, so that's kind of how fiscal policy can help with the balance of payments. And then, so finally, we've just got some different considerations for when to use the fiscal policy. So we've discussed about like the economic cycle. So if we're in a recession, we want to stimulate the economy, and if we're doing very well, we want to control inflation and like deflate or shrink the economy. So fiscal policy is good in a sense that it can be quite targeted, so we can just focus fiscal policy on a particular industry or a particular type of spending, right? But whereas compared to other policies, it might not be as flexible. Yeah. So yeah, one of the advantages of fiscal policy would be targeting. So I'll just put it here. Targeting or targeted to certain industries or regions. And another benefit of fiscal policy is that it's slightly quicker than supply side policy to grow the economy, so it can be more reactive. However, we've kind of discussed about the political issues. So political issues, unhappy, might be a problem with fiscal policy because it would affect it, and we can't make a solely economic decision on it. So yeah, generally quick as well. And another problem would be called crowding out. Yeah, so crowding out. So what crowding out means is sometimes when the government spends money and implements fiscal policy, so say if they want to if they want to create a new hospital in Warwick, I'm not sure why I said Warwick, but or maybe the Isle of Man, like in the middle of nowhere. So if they want to build a hospital in the Isle of Man, so we've got like a cross, yeah, like a hospital. And if the government does decide to build the hospital there, then this actually kind of takes away the opportunity for the private market to build the hospital, because the government has already kind of satisfied the demand for hospitals or medical services in the Isle of Man, so that you're kind of replacing the level of investment that the private market would put into the Isle of Man. So it's kind of like a duplication effect, but also it kind of like avoids the actual investment being done from businesses. So there's kind of not much point of doing that if the overall result would be the same. So the overall result is that there would still be a new hospital in those places, but then the government actually spent money that they didn't need to in the first place, because the private market would build the hospital anyway. So crowding out would be another problem with fiscal policy. Okay, and then I've got some comments here, just the one before inflation. I just read about it. Germany imports more services than exporting services. And at the same time, we export more goods than importing. Yeah. So England is the other way around. England actually exports more services than it imports, but England actually imports more goods than it exports. Yeah. And I think that's because of the high level of manufacturing in Germany. So you've got a lot of car manufacturers in Germany that are very well known, and it's really also due to German efficiency, I must say, and the productivity in terms of manufactured goods in Germany. So the one before inflation. So let's just do a quick look for the one before inflation. So the one inflation is unemployment. Yeah. So fiscal policy can help with unemployment because it can essentially produce more jobs if the government spends money to build a new hospital, or the government spends money on the military. Then you can become soldiers for the UK army. Okay, so I think that's pretty much it in terms of evaluation. Okay, yes. So it also depends on the multiplier, right? So for those that are familiar with the multiplier, the bigger the multiplier effect in the economy, the more effective fiscal policy would be. And that's because it means that the chain effect in the economy is greater. Yeah. So impact is more short-term and may not necessarily be recurring or long-lasting. Yeah. So supply-side policy tends to be more long-term compared to fiscal policy, and that's because it tends to fix some of the structural problems of the economy and tends to grow the economy in a more permanent way than just spending money or taking money away as a one-off thing. Can be targeted.